I'm Yuki TANAKA, belonging to School of Human Sciences at Osaka University. My presentation is about Guattari and mental disorder. Felix Guattari, who made the laboratory clinic his base, was undeniably influenced his daily experiences with people suffering from mental disorders. He placed a particular focus on schizo, often misapprehended. However, is that Guattari never presented schizo as an ideal healer. The question this presentation seeks to ask, then, is the following. Why did Guattari focus on mental disorder, including schizo? And what does it mean for Guattari to incorporate mental disorders into his thought? I'd like to decipher these questions from his descriptions in the Oedipus papers, Anti-Oedipus and Cosmosis. Section 1. Guattari's terminology about mental disorders. It is worth first examining how Guattari recorded mental disorders, especially schizo, by comparing it with other terminologies. First, it is simply wrong to equate Guattari's schizo with schizophrenia in modern psychiatry since the publication of DSM-3 in 1980. The classifications of mental disorders in Guattari and modern psychiatry are very different, so we'll use schizo instead of schizophrenia. In terms of classification of mental disorder, the terminology of Lacanian psychoanalysis can be said to have been broadly inherited by Guattari. In the Lacanian psychoanalysis, mental disorder is broadly classified into neurosis and psychosis. Further subcategories of neurosis include obsessive-compulsive neurosis and hysteria, while the subcategories of psychosis comprise paranoia and schizophrenia. However, whereas Lacanian psychoanalysis defined these categories exclusively on the basis of whether the name of the further was in control, Guattari did not do so. In other words, he abandoned the strict distinction between psychosis and neurosis. In this regard, Guattari's schizo has sometimes been associated with the schizoid position in object relations theory centering on Melanie Klein, who likewise did not distinguish between psychosis and neurosis. Certainly, Guattari's co-author uses object relations theory in the logical sense. However, this view differs from Guattari's in that object relations theory explains schizophrenia in terms of a regression to schizoid position. What is schizo if not regression? It is a process. In this respect, the work of R.D. Lane, who belongs to the anti-psychiatry movement, overlaps with Guattari's work. Lane places schizophrenia in the process of journey and sees it as a recovery of the subject without psychiatry. Similarly, Guattari sees schizo as part of a process that does not require psychiatry and advocates the process of schizo, but does not see the recovery of the subject beyond it. Moreover, Guattari does not belong to the anti-psychiatry movement in view of the psychiatric drug therapy at the laboratory clinic. Section 2. The Anti-Oedipus papers. Now, we would like to examine the disorder of schizo as a process as presented in the Anti-Oedipus papers, was compiled by Stephen Nader. Here, Guattari writes quite clearly why he focuses on schizo. There is a sort of reverse dialectic where what is most imperfect, most dissociated, causes the tune. It's a nonsense, schiz, that operates the actualization of all potentialities, and the deployment of our brains and consistency. As has been said, the way in which something incomplete reads the process is why Gadara focuses on schism. In what sense is it imperfect? For one thing, Gadara sees schism as being inevitably interrupted by the Oedipus complex. Schism proceeds in a way that overcomes the imperfection of the Oedipus complex. Another imperfection is that of the symbols used by the schism. The symbols are meaningless and incomplete, but they are also the key to the progress of the process. Let us examine more closely how Oedipus complex is involved in schism's process and would be overcome. In the anti-Oedipus papers, we are introduced to a process that progresses through the first, second, and third articulation. Of the third articulation, in which this process is primarily discussed, begins with Gadara's application of each articulation to the experience of schism of John Uri, his colleague at the laboratory clinic. In other words, the entire process of these three articulations is assumed to be the schism process. The first articulation is the desiring connection works from the term to tone. The emphasis is placed on the characteristic of the connection. Thus, the first articulation is a polyphonic state of desire. The introduction of the second articulation introduces the figure of Southern schism. Uri describes a conversation that he had with a young schism to whom he asked, "Who are your friends here at the laboratory?" The schism gave him two names. Uri thought about it for a minute and realized that those were the names of the two people sitting in the waiting room. Here, the schism is trying to force the question, "Do you have any friends?" to be answered by making the people present correspond to his friends. Gadara describes this situation as follows: and productive conjunction by univocalizes connections. So we have the signified and signified. Connective chains tagged onto one another, differentiating role of the phallus and the subject. This is the secondary articulation, a system that reduces the polyphony of desire in the primary articulation by making the connection that was the wild state of desire into a one-to-one correspondence. Its representative is the Oedipus complex. Finally, the third articulation is the polyphonic realm, free from the inhibition of the secondary articulation, and also free from the idea of assuming a subject or personality. This is the realm of the schizophrenic, as it is said that he, schizophrenic, works in the third articulation. It is noteworthy that the second articulation, in which the Oedipus complex operates before the third articulation, which is the domain of schism, is introduced by the appearance of schism. The schism certainly presents a way of being that is not interrupted by the Oedipus complex on the one hand, but there is no schism that does not pass through the Oedipus complex on the other. What is noteworthy, therefore, is how one arrives at the third articulation from Oedipus in the incomplete secondary articulation. This is where the discussion of the two types of signs introduced by Guattari, the figure sign and the power sign, comes into play. The figure sign is the separation break between representation and projection. The separation is a separation of body and personality, as in castration, and refers to the creation of a binary relationship. This is indeed a one-to-one correspondence, and in the process just described, it can be said that it belongs to the second articulation in a straightforward manner. The counterpart to the figure sign is a power sign. Since, as stated, a power sign umbilicus ab territoriality, said articulation as residue. This power sign belongs to the third articulation. Now, why do we focus on the above discussion of the two signs? It is because although they are pressed in different articulations, they are closely related to each other. For example, the following is said about the power sign. The power sign, the sign point, is continuously deterritorialized. It never stops producing figure signs, even tertiary ones, and being axiomatized, evading signifying chains, paired with significations, and all this through a pure logic of nonsense. Thus, the power sign is connected to the figure sign, and the key to this connection is the logic of meaninglessness referred to here, and this meaninglessness belongs rather to the figure sign. You can't condemn the figure sign nonsense, the ravages of mechanism, the destruction of nature and the environment, and advocate a return to better human understanding. What does it mean that figure signs are meaningless? The figure sign reinforces personality and dualistic viewpoint through its separation. But in order to make the separation strong, it must itself be groundless, indeed meaningless. This action of the figure sign in pursuit of meaninglessness is deterritorializing in that it transcends existing linguistic activity. And because this meaningless figure sign is meaningless and not bound by existing frameworks, it also leads to the activation of a new projection, that is, the power sign. Now, it is important to note that we are looking at the production of this meaningless figurative sign in schism. Since the ideas, capital, consciousness, perversion, dualism, archaism, neurosis exist, then schizorevolution will have to pile itself up on top of it all until it manages to surpass, to axiomatize these things and merge forward in the direction of deterritorialization. Is the only way to dissolve the distance between subject and object, the representation and the expression of power. There is a sort of reverse dialectic where what is most imperfect, most dissociated calls the tune. Is the nonsense skills that operates the actualization of all potentialities and the deployment of all planes of consistency. No specific examples of how the schizophrenic uses figure symbols are given. Nevertheless, schizophrenic use of language is sometimes used in a way because if you claim to measure a schizo text by the yardstick of Chomsky's grammaticality, you won't get very far. And the fact that it is outside the general semantic action is precisely the meaninglessness in schizo. Moreover, the meaninglessness is not confined to language use. The symptoms of schizophrenia also seem to be incomprehensible, as if they were out of semantic function. That is what Guterres describes as a schizophrenic catastrophe, abolition. In other words, meaninglessness that initiates the transition from the second to the third articulation is extracted by looking at this catastrophic situation of schism. To sum up, in his and Oedipus papers, Guattari presented the process of schism from the first to the third articulation. The transition from the second to the third articulation is related to the figure sign. The figure sign connects the process of the deterritorialization through its meaninglessness. Reading from the blocked second articulation to the liberated third articulation. The figure sign here is assumed to be the use of languages and catastrophic symptoms of the disorder of schism. The catastrophe of schism advances the process in a way that is both meaningless and leads generative change. Section 3. Anti-Oedipus. In the anti-Oedipus papers, we have taken the schisms as they are in reality. In fact, the descriptions in the anti-Oedipus papers can be read as such, but anti-Oedipus has a different flavor. In late years, Guattari cautioned about the attempt in the anti-Oedipus as follows. With Zeus, we struggled for years to clear up a terrible misunderstanding. Talking about schizophrenic entities or schizophrenics in hospitals is not the same as the schizophrenic process. In other words, the schizo discussed in the anti-Oedipus is only a schizo process, not a schizo that is considered a disorder in a psychiatric hospital. If this is the case, then it is not the case that Guattari was not thinking of mental disorder when he discussed schizo. What is being denied here is a disorder diagnosed in the asylum, not the mental disorder itself. While Guattari, or Dulce Guattari, largely dismisses the idea of schizo as a disorder in the general sense, and anti-Oedipus, he seems to explore the new meaning of mental disorder. First, how is schizo viewed in the anti-Oedipus? Since, as we are told that it is never a particular part of nature, etc., but nature as a process of production that the schizophrenic lives as a unique kind. Schizo is seen as one who lives the process. What this process is, Dulce assumes, is the process by which the desire machine is linked together, in which everything arises. Dulce says that the schizophrenia is essentially this process of production of desire and desire machine. This process of desire is a universal process, and thus one view that emerges is the serialist view that all people are schizos, and by drawing lines of right in the process of production, the schizo shows that he can overcome capitalism. In this way, as the schizo is in a sense removed from the framework of disorder, how then is schizo as a disorder viewed? The fact that schizo is regarded as a symptom and a clinical entity is a result of psychiatry's manipulation of the process. This is an accusation that psychiatry turns schizos into psychopathies by confining them in hospitals or associating them with Oedipus through psychoanalysis. Based on the universal process of schizo, Dulce introduces three operations by which various mental disorders are created: arrests, continuations in the body, and finalizations. First, when the process is arrested and the limit of desiring production are replaced by Oedipus, a neurosis develops. This is explained as the transfer of the original social investment and production to familial reproduction. Naturally, the process resists this neuroticization, but in doing so it finalizes itself. This is psychosis. The process then continues indefinitely, which is equivalent to an arrest of the process. The process never sees completion, the purpose becomes repression, and a terrible deterioration ensues. Alternatively, the process attempts to produce a new territory to replace Oedipus, but is eventually entangled in the Oedipal norm and the process is turning around in the void. This is perversion. Guattari further explains the above operation with the expression war. The neurotic approaches the war and frightened retreats. The pervert bursts or launches something along the wall, and the psychotic attacks the wall and hits the wall with his body. What this wall is a breakthrough from Oedipus, the completion as a process. The psychotic is the only one facing this wall this time, and thus the psychotic to whom the schizo belongs is recognized as the one closest to the process. Guattari here says, schizophrenia is a word, a breakthrough in the world, and at the same time, it is also a failure of this breakthrough. And it is precisely this failure of the psychotic and his madness that Guattari attempts to affirm. But this is not to privilege the madness as inherent to the disorder. When we all aim for breakthrough, it can appear as a word of disorder or insanity, and we should not brush it off. What anti-Oedipus presents is the mistake of judging and establishing schizo as a disorder, not denial of the disorder itself. As Yoshiyuki Koizumi states, anti-Oedipus tried to affirm schizophrenic at all costs. This affirmation may include the affirmation both of production with flight and the disorder itself. And the production is impossible without hitting one's head against it. Section 4. Cosmosis. From the late 1980s, especially after the years of winter, a period of stagnation in the mid-1980s, until his death in 1992, Guattari's terminology underwent major changes. As far as schizo is concerned, he simply used the word schizo much less frequently. As we have seen in Anti-Oedipus, while he largely dismissed schizo as a disorder in psychiatry, he did not deny its existence as disorder, which was undeniably a source of some confusion for readers and writers alike. However, the fact that the term psychosis, which can be clearly distinguished from schizo's process, is used in the later years of his life, shows that Guattari again addressed mental disorder. Why focus on psychosis? Guattari states, not heroism then of psychosis, but, on the contrary, an indulgent indexation of the cosmic body it carries to incandescence and whose bruised wrecks are today eaten away by chemotherapy, now that it has ceased being cultivated in the traditional asylum like so many monstrous flowers. Above all, not to underestimate the weight of systemic components, organic, somatic, imaginary, familial, social, within the psychotic process, but to indicate the effects of intercomponential inhibitions which will lead to stand-off with cosmic immanence. That is, to create a new index for psychosis, not in the way that psychiatric asylums diagnose it, to search for the inhibitions that are usually suppressed as symptoms in the psychotic process. This is newly formulated in the term cosmic immanence. it can be seen that it overlaps with what has been said in the discussion of figure sign and war. What happens when we actually deal with disorder? Guattari says, I do not, for example, discuss with a mentally deranged patient. Sometimes there are psychotic attacks with ethnocentric delirium, aversion to difference, estrangement, and so on. What is important is to try to understand how these subjective dynamic configurations end up in a modeling of reality that is quite different from mine, and to enter into symbolic relations of production to escape from this kind of impasse. To break away from consensual politics and embrace the otherness of the other, its difference. I believe that something will arrive from this ethical movement of rebooting of the other. It is not by discussing the disorder with patient and urging them to change that we can explore the inhibition in disorder and create index. The first step is to accept the person's disorder as it is and find out what is happening there. By doing so, we can accept the differences, and this will trigger the arrival of something. Guattari is not afraid to assume that this something is healing for the disordered person. In this respect, after all, unlike anti-psychiatry, Guattari does not deny disorder itself. Rather, he seeks to use the problem of disorder as an opportunity to analyze it more forthrightly. This is very much in line with the attempts at study of party in Japan. Study of party, which began with a meeting of schizophrenics at Betelnoye in the town of Urakawa in Hokkaido, northern Japan, is an attempt by people who have disorders to model themselves again as people with problems, rather than explaining themselves in terms of symptoms given to them by psychiatry. In this study, the patient faces his or her problems head-on and tries to create a way to help him or herself. This leads to responses and connections in meetings, which in turn leads to the acceptance of others. However, while there is certainly an overlap between Guattari's claim and the study of party, it can be said that Guattari demands a more intense confrontation with the problems. In other words, it requires an awareness of oppression, inhibitions, social norms, and so on. Conclusion. Now that we have reviewed the above discussions, let us answer the question posed at the beginning of this presentation. Why did Guattari focus on mental disorder, including schizo? In the anti-Oedipus papers, it was because schizo shows that they are tormented by the Oedipus complex but overcomes it. In Oedipus, it was because they alone face the war, the breakthrough of capitalism. In Cosmosis, that attitude was rephrased as cosmic immanence. After all, as an expression, that of the anti-Oedipus would be easier to understand, only they beat their heads against the wall, even if it is a problem in itself. There is no way to break through capitalism without going through such a problem. What does it mean for Guattari to incorporate disorder into thought? Cosmosis, while accepting disorder as difference, shows that it can be a catalyst for healing. Guattari has certainly made it clear that mental disorder is not unique, but that is not to deny that mental disorder is different from normal psychological state. It is precisely this difference that led Guattari himself to his own problem. How much better are we at looking at the problem than those who have the disorder?